What's going on, you guys, and welcome to the channel. In this video, I'm going to be going over FastAPI with JWT User Authentication. Now, as a quick side note, this topic has been covered in the past by me in the React FastAPI playlist. So, if you are interested, please feel free to go ahead and check that out. However, this sort of topic is something that is obviously independent of the React FastAPI stuff. So I thought it would be a good idea to kind of cover this on its own. So to begin with, let's go ahead and create a directory and just jump inside that directory. My directory is FastAPI-auth, so name it what you will. And then within here, let's get started with creating our virtual environment. Just give that a second. Then let's go ahead and make the necessary installations. So first one is going to be, actually, first of all, we need to activate it. So source bin or venv bin activate. So you should see the venv here with the brackets. Next, for the installation, so pip install, and we'll make them all at once. That way we don't have to keep going back and forth. First one is going to be FastAPI, and then square brackets all. And I'm wrapping this around like 2 double quotes, as for me, it kind of complains when it comes to these square brackets. The next one is going to be pyjwt, and this is for our JWT JSON web tokens. Next is going to be SQL Alchemy, which is spelled alchemy, like that. Next is going to be passlib, and then square brackets. Actually, we can just leave it as passlib like that. And then email-validator, and this is just for email validation. And then just hit enter. Just give that a second to collect everything. So now that everything's been installed, let's go ahead and open up the text editor. So I'm going to use VS Code, and for me, it's just opening it as code and then a period, which opens it all up. And I have my virtual environment folder there. I'm just going to zoom in as it's quite small. Yeah, so let's begin by going ahead and setting up our database. So to do that, let's just open up a file, say database.py, and let's import all the necessary things. So import first SQL Alchemy. I'm just going to call this as _SQL. Next, import SQL Alchemy.ext.declarative as _declarative. And then the SQL ORM, so .orm as _ORM. And I'm just going to install black as well as a formatter. You don't have to do that. It's just a personal preference. But yeah, so first things first is that this tutorial is, I'm going to be using SQLite for this. However, you can go ahead and use Postgres, MySQL, whatever your choice is as a database, preferably a SQL database, as it's pretty much the same thing. All it is the only difference is, to be honest, just this file here, where your database URL will be different depending on what you're using. But for SQLite, I'm just going to say SQLite : 1, 2, 3 / and then I'm just going to call this database.db. You can name this whatever you want. I just think database.db is fine. And then the engine. So for the engine, we can just say engine equals _SQL.create engine, and then the database URL. And then if you are using SQLite, then you need this connect args argument here. So connect _args. And for that, we're just going to pass in a dictionary, which will just say check same thread. And this is going to be false. And as stated before, you only need this part if you are using SQLite. The next part is to have our session. So we'll say session local equals underscore ORM dot session maker, and then we'll set auto commit to false, the auto flush to false, and then just the engine that we need to bind. So bind equals engine, like so. And then finally, we can create our base class. So base equals underscore declarative dot declarative base. So that's our database file. The next thing is to create our models. So let's go ahead and do that in a new file. Actually, I'm just going to turn this into a Python module by adding our init underscore underscore init underscore underscore dot py file. Just going to add that there. And then, yeah, let's create our models file. So models.py. Now for that, what we need is our our imports. So I'm just going to create our user class, and as kind of like a additional part of this to see how else you can use our authentication, I'm going to create another model which is going to be post, and this post is just going to be a very basic version of a tweet. So the same way as you would model that. So import date time as underscore DT, import SQL alchemy as underscore SQL, import SQL alchemy.orm as underscore ORM, and then import passlib.hash, and you'll see how this comes into play later, as underscore hash. And we also need our database. So import database as underscore database. Cool. So let's create our user. So we'll say user, and this will inherit from our database.base model that we created. We'll give it a table name. We'll say users. Next, we'll add the ID. We'll say SQL.column. And in there, underscore SQL.integer. Primary key is true. And index, we'll set that to true as well. Next, we want the email. So the email that the user has, SQL.column underscore SQL.string. This will be unique, as we don't want two users with the same email, and index is going to be true. Then we want the hashed password. So underscore SQL dot column, and we'll say SQL dot string. And then the date created, we'll just add that for the sake of it. So underscore SQL dot column, SQL dot date time, and the default will be underscore date time, so underscore DT date time dot UTC now. So this will just generate the date automatically for us. We won't have to actually add that in. So every time we create something in this table, this is filled given the time it was created. And next, let's go ahead and create our posts table. So we'll say class post, and this will be database.base. We'll have the table name. So we'll say posts, and then the ID. So we can just copy ID from this. Then we'll have the owner ID. So owner underscore ID, and that's going to be the user itself. So SQL column, and then underscore SQL dot integer. And this is going to be a foreign key. So foreign key, we'll say users dot ID. So yeah, that's the owner foreign key. Next, we want the actual text. So we'll say post underscore text. This will be underscore SQL dot column SQL, and then just string, and you can have it as text or whatever. It's really up to you. And then we'll have the date created, so we can just go ahead and copy that here from this. And then we'll set our owner, so owner equals underscore ORM dot relationship, and then we'll set that to user. We'll say back populates equals and then posts. We also want to add that here with our user model. So to do that, we can just say pretty much the same, posts equals underscore ORM dot relationship post, and then back populates owner. Okay, so we have our two models. The next thing is I want to create a function inside our user class, which will help us to verify a password. So we'll say verify underscore password, say function self, and then password, which is going to be one of the arguments. That's going to be a string. And what this will do is say return underscore hash dot bcrypt. For some reason, it's not showing up on mine, but it's there. Verify, and then password, and then the self.hash password. So it's going to check the password that we pass in. So when a user wants to sign in, they'll check that password with their hashed one. If it matches up, then we're good to go. So some extra kind of encryption is done behind the scenes, decoding, whatnot, but this handles it all for us. Okay, so that's our user model. Now let's go ahead and create our function to create the database. So in here, we'll say services.py, and then let's go ahead and import database first. So import database as underscore database. And in our function, we'll say create underscore database, which we'll call, and I'm just going to put an underscore here as we don't want to import it anywhere else. So return, and what we want to do is say database.base.metadata.create underscore all, and then bind equals underscore database.engine. And that should be it. Now we can go ahead and use this. So we'll open up the terminal. And let's go ahead and call it. So first of all, and just keep an eye out on the file explorer, you'll see this database.db file being created as soon as you run this. So we'll say Python, and make sure your virtual environment is activated. But let's import services. Then we'll say services._create database. And now we have our database.db file right there. Now, one side note is I have an extension in my VS Code. You can also go ahead and use it or install it. It's this SQLite here. So SQLite by Alex CVZZ. This just gives us a way of viewing our SQL database. So if I go now to my database.db, I can right click it, open database. And then down here, you see the SQLite Explorer. If you expand that, you will see our database.db. So yeah, that's our database there. The next step is to actually go ahead and start with our endpoints. So the first thing I'm going to do is create our main.py file. And this is where all our FastAPI stuff will go. So in here, I'm first going to import FastAPI. So import FastAPI as underscore FastAPI. Next, I'm going to import FastAPI.security as underscore security. And I also want the SQL Alchemy stuff. So SQL Alchemy.orm as underscore ORM. And let's just import let's start up the app actually. So app equals underscore FastAPI.FastAPI. Okay, so before we actually jump into creating our endpoints, the first thing is to create our schemas. So I'm going to create a new file. It's called schemas.py. And what we'll do here is create our models, so our pedantic models for our user. So when we want to create our user, when we want to return a user, and our post. So to do that, let's first import datetime as underscore DT and import pedantic as underscore pedantic. Okay, so let's create our base class for our user. So class and then underscore user base, and then pedantic dot base model. We'll have our email, this is our string, and this is because both the user create pedantic model that we will have and the just user one will both have email, so we will inherit from user base just like this. So user create, this will be user base, inherit from that, and then we'll have the password string class config, and then ORM mode equals true. This is just to stop lazy loading, which comes with SQL Alchemy, I think. Yeah, so we'll then have our class user, which will inherit from user base again. And this time, rather than having the password, because when we return the user, we don't want to return the password with them. We just want the ID and the date created. So why not just put that in there as well? And this will be of type dt.datetime. And we'll add the same class config. And we'll say ORM mode equals true. Cool, so that's our user. Let's just go ahead and create our post model. So class and then underscore post base. This will take pedantic and then base model. We'll have just the post text. And then we'll create our post create, and this will have nothing new. It's just in terms of clarity and readability. So we'll just say pass, because when we create it, we're only just going to be passing in the text that we want for our post or our status update. So we can leave it as that. It's just there for extra readability and clarity. Class and then post. So post base. Here we'll have the ID. We'll have the owner underscore ID, which is integer. We'll have the date created, which is underscore dt.datetime. And then finally the config ORM underscore mode equals true. Cool, so now we have our schemas in place. Let's jump back into main.py and get started with our endpoints. So the first endpoint is our creating an actual user. So we'll say app.post /API and then users. We'll have an asynchronous endpoint and we'll call this create user. This will take in a user, and the way in which this user is going to model is going to be based on our schema user create. So we need to import that. Import schemas as underscore schemas. And then we'll say user create. We have our DB, And we actually need to go back to our services file and make use of this. So for now, we'll say FastAPI depends, and then that's not the type. We need _orm.session, and that's our type. And then we want to set this to FastAPI.depends. And in there, we want to make use of a function that we're going to create now, services.getDB. So first of all, let's just import services. Just shrink that a bit. Import services as _services. And I'm just going to put pass for now. So let's go back into our services file and create a new function called getDB, as this endpoint here relies on that function here. So it will depend on, you can read it like that, this database connection that we create. And we'll just do that by creating a help function. So we'll say get_db. This will say db equals _database dot session local. This creates a new connection or session to our database. It will then yield the database, otherwise, and then finally, so it will just close it. So we don't want the database to remain open at any time. Okay, so that's our getDB working. So we have that there. The next thing is to actually create our function that will first check to see if a user exists. So just before I get started with creating our function to find a user based on the email that's provided, there is one thing I missed out, which is, or two things actually. The first one is that when we created our database.db file, our SQLite database, we didn't have the users and the post table in there. So let's quickly just go ahead and do that. The first thing is to import models in our services file as _models. And then in the terminal, make sure the environment is active. I'm just going to zoom in a bit, but I'm just going to run Python import services again, and then services dot _create database, which recreates our database.db file. In that, I'm just going to open the database in SQLite Explorer. You now have posts and users, so that's working fine. And lastly, there's just one more installation, Python package installation that we need to make, and that is passlib, but we also want bcrypt. So to do that, it's just pip install and then passlib and then square brackets bcrypt. I wrap it around double quotes as pip sometimes complains. So just hit enter and you should have it. Oops. Clear that. Okay, so now let's get back into the actual thick of it. So to get started, or to carry on from where we left off, let's do async def and then get user by email. We'll provide an email in there, which is a string, and the database ORM session, ORM.session. And we need to import that. So we'll just say back at the top, import SQL alchemy.orm as _orm. Okay, so that's get email by get the user by the email. So we'll say return a db.query. In there, we'll use the models.user and then filter _models. Oops, all this is getting in the way. Models user.email, and we'll check again. Why does that happen? And then if it equals the email that we pass in, as it's a filter, we get back a query set. So we actually just want the first element. So we can just say first.first, like so. So yeah, that's our get user by email. Now back in our main.py file, we can go ahead and call it. So we can say db underscore user equals await as asynchronous services dot get user by email. We'll say the email is equal to user dot email, so the email that's provided, and then db equals db, just like that. Okay, so if we actually get a user back, so when it comes to the service, this function that we wrote in, this will, if a user exists based on the email, we'll get back a user object. Otherwise, we'll get back none. So if there's no user that exists by that email, we get none. So what we can say is if db user, so if it does exist, raise, and then we'll make a HTTP exception, and we'll say the status code is 400, and the detail, we'll set that to user with that email already exists. Okay, otherwise we want to then go ahead and create the user. So I'm just going to add some comments in. So create the user, and then we want to return the token, as in our use case, when a user signs up, they are automatically logged in. So we want to also then return the token, the JWT token. So let's jump back into our services file and create those functions. So the first one is going to be creating a user. So we'll say async create underscore user. This will take in a user, which will be schemas. So I'm just going to import schemas back at the top of services.py, schemas as underscore schemas. And here we'll say schemas dot user create. So this one here. And the DB is going to be a ORM session like that. Okay, so first of all, we want to check to see if check that the email is valid. And this is kind of like a bit of additional kind of validation that I've added. You know, it's not important for the scope of this tutorial, but it'd just be nice to have. And we're going to make use of the email validator that we installed earlier. So I'm going to say import SQL or email validator as, I'm just going to call it underscore email underscore check. So back here in our create user, we're going to create a try block. And first we're going to say valid equals email check dot validate email. And we'll say email equals user dot email. Then we'll say the email equals valid dot email. Otherwise, we want to raise an exception if there is email check, a email not valid. So if the email is not valid, we want to raise a HTTP exception. And usually I would not do this in the services.py file. However, in this case, just to kind of cut corners, I'm going to add that. So we don't need that there. I'm just going to import FastAPI as underscore FastAPI. Kind of breaks the pattern a little bit of kind of keeping our services separate. But anywho, let's just stick with this. FastAPI.http exception, and then we'll have the status code of 404, and then the detail will be please enter a valid email. Okay, so that's if the email is not valid. Otherwise, let's create our user objects. We'll say models.user. We'll pass in the email as email, the hashed password, and this is going to be something that we're going to create above this. So we'll say hashed underscore password equals, and we need to make use of the hash package module that comes with passlib. So I'm just going to say import passlib dot hash as underscore hash. And down here, I'm going to say underscore hash dot bcrypt dot hash, pass in the password, so user.password. And then back here, I'm just going to add hashed password to that. So yep, that's our user object. The next thing we want to do is add that to our database, so db.add, and then user object. We want to then commit it. And let's just refresh on the user object and return user object. Cool, so that's our create user, so we can kind of tick that box off here. And let's go ahead back in our main.py. Let's say the user is await underscore services dot create user, and the user will be the user and the DB will be set to DB. Next, we want to return the token. So we're going to be making use of this user here. So back in services, let's go ahead and create another function for creating a token. And to do that, we'll just say async create underscore token. This will take in a user from our models, and we'll then convert this into our user schema object. A bit of a mouthful for a variable name, but just for clarity, we'll say schemas.users user from ORM, and we'll say throw in user. So that'll just take in our user model from our actual model and turn it into our schema object. Next, we want to convert this into a dict. So we'll say user dict equals user schema object, and then dict. And we'll just delete the date created from that. It won't permanently delete it. It's only in memory. This is just so we can encode it properly with JWT. Otherwise, it just brings up errors if we have a date time in there. So say user dict and date underscore created. And then token equals, and we want to import JWT. So let's say back up the top, import JWT as underscore JWT. Down below, we'll say JWT.encode and the user dict. And we want a JWT secret, so a secret that we'll use. And all the time, like only for this tutorial, I'm not going to do it, but 100% of the time, you will always store the JWT secret in like a .env file. Again, just to cut corners, I'm going to store it here. And I'm just set it to whatever you want. I'm just going to say this is not very safe. But back down there, we'll say underscore JWT secret to encode it. And yeah, finally, let's go ahead and return something. So return dict, we'll say access underscore token equals the token. And then the token, it's annoying that this keeps popping up, token type equals, and then in quotes, bearer. So that's our create token. Back in the main.py file, let's go ahead and say return await and then services.create token, and we'll pass in our user object here. So that should pretty much be it for creating a user. I'm just going to zoom out a little bit, and I'm going to run the server, so uvi corn main :app -- reload. Now back here, back in the browser, let's go ahead and jump to it. So localhost :8000/docs. And let's try it out. So right now, I have automatically add string and string to email and password. We know that email is not a valid password. We know that the string is not a valid email. So let's go ahead and try it out, see if we get an error back, execute, and we get, please enter a valid email. I'm just going to zoom out. So yeah, so we know our email checker is working. Now let's actually add a valid email, so I'll just say string@gmail.com, execute, and we get back the access token, which is this really long encrypted JWT string, and the token type, which is bearer. So creating one is actually working fine. We can actually look in our SQLite Explorer here. If I just refresh it and then click play next to users, I get back the email along with the hashed password and the date created. So that's working out smoothly. Now let's move along into the next areas, which is to actually generate a token. And this is what you'll use for logging back in. So this is more of the sign up part. Now let's do the logging in. So back in main.py, I'm going to create a new endpoint, app.post, and this is to, we'll call this /API/token, and we'll say async generate token. And this is going to be form_data. The type for this is going to be _security. So what we imported up here before. And we're going to use Oauth 2 password request form. And this is just basically a form, but it's made more for like authorization, and it's just like it's more of a helper. But yeah, so we'll set that as a type, FastAPI, and this will depend on, this is what it depends on, so FastAPI.depends, and then we want the DB to be a _ORM.session, and this will be FastAPI, just gonna shrink it a bit, FastAPI depends, and we'll call services.getDB. So a bit of a mouthful. So yeah, take your time in typing this out. Let's say pass for now, just so it formats it. So yeah, we have two arguments, the form data, which is of type Oauth 2 password request form, and our DB session, our database session. Okay, so the first thing is we want a function that will actually authenticate a user. So a user will provide their email and their password. We want to provide that email and password into a function to see if this user is authorized. So back in services.py, let's create a function. We'll call this async authenticate user. This will take in an email, which is a string, and a password, which is also a string, along with the ORM.session. And here, let's say user equals await get user by email, email equals email, and DB equals DB. So first of all, if we don't get a user back, so if not user, then return false. If not, and then user.verify password, so the helper function that we added into our user, so verify password, and then we'll throw in the password as password. I think that's what we called it, is password, yeah. So if they're not verified, then we return false again. Otherwise, we'll just return the user. So that's our authenticate user. Now in our main.py file, we can call that. We can say user equals await, and then services.authenticate user, email, and then form data.username. So it's not email, it's username. A username is just the generic term for it. Password equals form data, dot password. Then we can go ahead and say if not user, raise a HTTP exception, and we'll say that the status code is a 401 and the detail is invalid credentials. Cool. And then finally, we can call the create token. So we can say return await create services.create token, and we'll throw in user like so. And yeah, in our authenticate user, we also just want to pass in the DB session. But that's really it. So we get a user if it authenticates properly. So if there's no user, if it returns false, then we get an we raise an exception. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and create a token for that user. So let's go back now and check this out. If I just refresh this, and let's call generate token, try it out. And we have this form. The two things that it's asking us is the username and password. So for the username, let's type in string@gmail.com, as that was one that was created last time. Password was just string. Let's go ahead and execute it. And we get back the access token and the token type. Now, if we passed in something that was invalid, so instead of string, we'll say something like string234, execute it, and we get invalid credentials. So that's working fine. If we passed in the incorrect password, so instead of string, let's add in 123, execute, and we get back invalid credentials. And it's important to put invalid credentials as you don't want to give away what form field was incorrect. So yeah, that's our API generate token. The next one is to actually create an endpoint that retrieves the user that's currently signed in. And this is just to ensure that, yeah, like let's say a user signs in and tomorrow they jump back in and they make a request. You just want to make sure that they're still authenticated. So back in main.py, let's create a endpoint. We'll say app.get, and this is fairly small in comparison to our last ones. And we'll say /API users and me /me, and then the response model, we'll say schemas.user async, and then get user. This will just say user, and it was taking the type schemas.user, and this will depend on a function called getCurrentUser. So we'll say FastAPI.depends, and this is really nice as like this depends kind of does some of the work for us before we jump into the actual body of the function. We'll say services, and we'll end up creating a function called getCurrentUser. So in here, we'll just return the user. So let's actually create our getCurrentUser. So inside of services, we'll create a function and we'll call this getCurrentUser. Yep, getCurrentUser db_orm.session, and this will depend on the FastAPI getDB. So FastAPI depends, and then get_db. The token, which is a string, and the default for that will just be _FastAPI depends. And we need to create our Auth2 schema. And again, this is more for checking fast. It's just like more of a helper for checking whether or not someone is authenticated. So back at the top, I'm just going to say Oauth2 and then schema. And this is really handy as FastAPI does kind of a bit of the work for us. We'll say security. Actually, we need to import that. So back here we'll import FastAPI.security as underscore security. And here we'll say security.oauth and then Oauth2 password bearer. And we'll just give it the endpoint, so /API/token. And then back down here, we'll just say depends on Oauth2 schema. Pass that and let it just format itself. But yeah, so this token depends on our current authorization, who's currently authorized. And now we're going to go ahead and check to see if the token matches with the user that's signed in. So we'll say try and payload equals underscore JWT and decode rather than encode, so decode token, and then the JWT secret along with the algorithm for decoding. So algorithms will say HS and then 256. Next we'll say user equals db.query and underscore query the models, the user model, and then get, and we'll say payload. As it's a dictionary, we'll just access the ID that comes with it. So then we'll say if it fails, if we don't get back a user, then we'll raise a FastAPI.http exception, and we'll say the status code is 401, sorry, and the detail is invalid email or password. And then finally, we'll return the user, but in the schemas user form. So we'll say return underscore schemas dot user from ORM, and we'll throw in the user. Back in main.py, like it's all working fine. Now let's go ahead and check this out. So if I just refresh this, we see here we have this authorize button there, and that's because of our the things that we added, like our Oauth2 password bearer, and yeah, that's pretty much it. Along with the depending on that. So let's go ahead and give it a try. Authorize. Let's do string at gmail.com. String authorize. So yeah, we've been authorized now. And yeah, I'm a bit confused about why it's locked now, but yeah, it should be working fine. You can try this out, execute, and we get back the user that's currently signed in. So string at gmail.com, the ID and the date they were created. And you can see here the curl command that we used for that. So we can actually test this out in your command line. But yeah, so that's our get current user. The next step is to actually kind of use this for creating other objects. So remember when we created our post model, let's use that a bit along with our authentication that we've added. So I'm just going to go ahead in main.py. I'm going to create a endpoint, so post. We'll call this /API and then posts. The response model is going to be schemas.post. So async and then create underscore post. This will take in a post, which will use the schemas.post create. The user, which will be dependent on schemas .user. We'll say FastAPI.depends, and then services.get current user. And then finally, db the database session, so underscore orm.session equals FastAPI.depends on services.get underscore db. So put pass for now, just to format it. but we want to create a service function to create a post. Now to do that, let's jump back into services, and this one shouldn't take too long at all. We'll say async and then create underscore post, and we'll say the user or underscore schemas dot user db underscore orm dot session, and then post, which is underscore schemas dot post create. And yeah, that should be it. Then let's create our post object. So post equals models dot post, and we'll unpack post dot dicts. Just save us from writing in all the extra fields. The owner ID is going to be user.id. Then we'll just add that to the database. So add post, and then db.commit, db.refresh on the post object, and then finally return schemas.post.from ORM, and then just pass in the post. So that's the create post. Here we can say return await services dot create post. We'll say user equals user, db session equals db, and the post equals the post in the argument. So let's go ahead and test it. Let's just refresh this. As it's refreshed, I don't think we're authenticated. So if we actually try this out now and we put in something like hello world, execute, and we get detail not authenticated. So let's authorize ourselves. So string at gmail.com. And then let's try this out now. So execute. We get back post text, hello world, ID 1, the owner ID, so the owner of who posted it. So that was string at gmail.com, the ID of that user, and the day it was created at. Next, let's just as a final finishing touch, let's go ahead and create a endpoint that will allow us to get all the posts of a user. So we'll say app.get, and this will be /API/posts. And for that, the response model is going to be a list. So for that, we need to import typing. So from typing, import list. Back down here, we'll say that the response model is a list of schemas.post, and then async def, and then get underscore user posts, the user, which is schemas.user, and we can actually just copy that from this here to save some time. And then we also want the DB ORM session, so take that too. And we get some weird format. Okay, it's extra equals. Okay, yeah. So we have the user and the database session. We don't want to post because obviously we're not creating a status update or whatever. So in here, we're going to call a service function that will get back all the posts. So here we'll say get user posts, and this will be a user underscore schemas.user, and the DB session or dot session, and we'll say posts equals db.query, and then underscore models dot post filter by, and we want to filter it by the owner ID. So owner underscore ID equals user.id, and we can just return a list and map each of those posts to the from ORM. So we'll say schemas dot post dot from ORM and then posts. Now let's go ahead and call that. So we'll say return await and then services dot get user posts, user equals user, db equals db. Nice. So that's all our endpoints. Let's just check this out. If I just refresh this, we're no longer authenticated, but if I actually call for all the posts, oops, not this one, not create posts, but get user posts, try it out, execute, we get back not authenticated. Let's authorize ourselves. So string at gmail.com and then string as password, authorize. Now let's execute this. We get back the posts and we can keep adding some and we'll get back a list of them. But that's pretty much it. I did a bit more than what's actually expected of this video in terms of what we're covering. But hopefully you see the connection of how you can also use how we use authorized users to create or use that with other endpoints, along with just the main thing that we wanted to cover, which is the JWT authentication with FastAPI. And just as a side note, you can easily use this with Postgres. You just have to change up your database URL. But other than that, the code is also in the description below. So feel free to check that out. And other than that, I wish you good health and I hope to see you in the next video.